Chris Dickerson won the 1982 Mr. Olympia at 43 years old with some of the best calves ever seen on a bodybuilding stage. He placed second at 2 consecutive Olympias before that victory. He won over 50 competitions across 3 decades. And yet, if you ask most bodybuilding fans today to name the great Mr. Olympia champions, his name rarely comes up. This is the story of how Chris Dickerson became the most overlooked Mr. Olympia in history. And the real reason he remains overlooked will surprise you. Montgomery, Alabama, 1939. Chris Dickerson was born the youngest of triplets in a household that understood barriers better than most. His mother, Mahala Ashley Dickerson, was Alabama's first black female attorney and a civil rights advocate who fought for women and minorities when the Jim Crow South made that fight dangerous. The Dickerson home wasn't just about survival. It was about excellence. Education mattered. Discipline mattered. Carrying yourself with dignity when the world tried to strip it away mattered most of all. Chris grew up quiet, artistic, thoughtful. He wasn't a loud triplet. He was the one watching, observing, learning how things worked before making his move. He attended Olney Friends School, a Quaker boarding school in Ohio, where he graduated in 1957. Then he moved to New York City in 1959 to study acting, singing, and ballet at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Think about that for a second. A young black man from Montgomery, Alabama, studying ballet and opera in New York during the late 1950s. That took courage most people can't imagine. Chris wasn't chasing muscle. He was chasing art, performance, the transformation of the body into something expressive and powerful. He wanted to sing opera. He wanted to act. He wanted to move across a stage and make people feel something. A vocal instructor told him to strengthen his chest to support his singing voice. That single piece of advice changed the trajectory of his entire life. Chris walked into a weight training gym and discovered something that combined every discipline he loved: precision, control, presentation, and the transformation of the body into living sculpture. But this wasn't the usual path into bodybuilding. No high school football, no powerlifting background, no ego-driven pursuit of size for the sake of intimidation. Chris Dickerson approached bodybuilding the way a dancer approaches choreography and a sculptor approaches marble. And there was a quiet strength in him that judges never fully understood. He started training seriously in the early 1960s, a time when bodybuilding was still underground. No major sponsorships, no television coverage, just small gyms, iron plates, and men chasing an ideal most of the world thought was strange. Chris saw photos of Bill Pearl in a muscle magazine and decided that was a level of development he wanted. Not just big, refined, proportional, complete. Every muscle group developed to balance every other muscle group. No weak points, no shortcuts, just relentless attention to detail. Chris moved to Los Angeles and began training at Bill Pearl's gym, where Pearl became his coach and mentor for most of his competitive life. Pearl's gym wasn't about chasing new poundage every week or setting records that would impress powerlifters. It was about building a physique that looked finished from every angle. Pearl taught Chris to think about muscle shape, not just muscle size. He taught him to rehearse his posing as seriously as his lifting. Every transition between poses mattered. Every angle had to tell a story. The stage wasn't just a place to flex. It was a place to perform. While other bodybuilders were focused on adding mass and lifting heavier, Chris and Bill were focused on perfection. Not just bigger, better, more complete, more balanced, more beautiful. Chris entered his first competitions in the mid-1960s and started placing immediately. Third at the AAU Junior Mr. USA in 1966. Third at the AAU Mr. USA in 1968. Second in 1969. He was always close, always in the mix. You could see the judges respected his physique, but something kept him just outside the winner's circle. Then in 1970, he won the AAU Mr. America overall title and became the first African American to do so. That victory was historic. It opened doors, but it also revealed how narrow those doors still were. The bodybuilding world in 1970 wasn't particularly progressive. Magazine covers favored certain looks, certain personalities, certain backgrounds. Promoters wanted marketable champions who fit a specific image. Chris didn't fit the mold they were selling, but he kept training, kept refining, kept showing up on stage with physique that was undeniable. His physique was different from what most people expected from a champion. At 5'6" and around 190 pounds in contest shape, Chris wasn't the biggest man on stage, but his proportions made every pound count in ways taller. Heavier competitors couldn't match. Wide clavicles gave him shoulder width that created a classic V-taper. Round delts that looked like cannonballs tied perfectly into a full, thick chest with crisp separation between the pec fibers. His back had sharp detail through the middle and good width across the lats for his frame. His arms measured 18 inches with balanced triceps and biceps. No overdevelopment in either head, just perfect proportion. But his calves were legendary. Deep diamond shape from the back. Full, sweeping curves from the side. Striations that looked carved by a master sculptor. Some of the best calves in bodybuilding history. And people who saw him live will tell you photos didn't do them justice. What separated Chris from almost everyone else was the flow. Every muscle connected to the next muscle, without awkward gaps or jarring transitions. His physique looked like it was designed by an architect who understood how lines should move across a structure. When he hit a front double bicep, your eye traveled smoothly from his calves up through his quads, across his abs, over his chest, and out to his arms without getting stuck anywhere. That's rare. Most physiques have one or two areas that pull focus away from everything else. Chris had balance, so complete it was almost invisible. His physique wasn't loud, but it was unforgettable to those who truly looked. He moved into professional ranks and dominated the NABBA universe in 1973 and 1974, winning overall titles both years. These weren't small shows. NABBA was one of the premier organizations in bodybuilding before the IFBB fully took over. Winning back-to-back universe titles meant you were among the best in the world. Chris competed in nearly 50 contests over his career, racking up wins across multiple federations and weight classes. Then he entered the IFBB professional circuit in 1979 and placed fourth at his first Mr. Olympia in the lightweight class. The message was clear. He belonged at the top level. The next year, 1980, he came back better, sharper, more complete, more confident, and he nearly won everything. Between 1980 and 1982, Chris Dickerson competed in 15 professional shows. He won 10 of them. In every single loss, he placed second. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 wins, 5 second-place finishes, no thirds, no fourths, no bad showings. That's not a good career stretch. That's dominance. That's being the best bodybuilder in the world for 3 straight years. But history doesn't remember it that way. And there's a specific reason why. Because every time Chris placed second, the story the magazines told wasn't about him. It was about someone else's comeback, someone else's legacy, someone else's drama. Chris was always the other guy in the photo. The 1980 Mr. Olympia in Sydney was one of the most controversial contests in the sport's history. Arnold Schwarzenegger came back after 5 years away from competition. He hadn't been training seriously. He showed up looking softer than his prime, less detailed than the men he was standing next to. Many considered Chris one of the favorites given his incredible condition and perfect symmetry. But when the judges announced the final result, Arnold stood in first place and Chris stood in second. Competitors walked off stage in protest. Mike Mentzer, who placed fifth, called it a fix. Fans debated the decision for years. Some still debate it today. But the narrative that stuck in mainstream memory wasn't about Chris Dickerson nearly winning or getting robbed. It was about Arnold's triumphant comeback. Chris was written into history as a footnote in someone else's story, a supporting character in Arnold's final chapter. The following year, 1981, Franco Columbu returned to competition after his own retirement. Again, many experts and fans believe Chris deserved the title. He came in sharp balance and more complete than almost anyone on stage. Again, the judges gave the Sando Trophy to the returning legend. Franco placed first. Chris placed second. Another controversial decision. Another year of standing next to the winner while the cameras focused somewhere else. But Chris didn't complain publicly. He didn't trash the judges in magazine interviews or start feuds with other competitors. He went back to Bill Pearl's gym and kept working. That quiet dignity was part of who he was. It came from his mother's teachings, from his Quaker school upbringing, from a lifetime of navigating spaces that didn't always want him there. But in a sport that rewarded loud personalities and dramatic storylines, silence made you forgettable. Humility made you easy to overlook. Chris won the Night of Champions in 1980. He won the Grand Prix New York, the Grand Prix Miami, the the Grand Prix California. He won the Florida Pro Invitational. He won the Canada Pro Cup. Over and over, he stepped on stage and walked away with first place. But the two times it mattered most, the two Olympias, he stood in second. And yet, despite all this, despite 2 years of heartbreak and controversial decisions, he stepped on stage again in 1982, ready to change history. Here's the truth about why Chris Dickerson is the most overlooked Mr. Olympia ever. He won the sport's highest title at the exact moment the sport wasn't ready to celebrate him. The 1982 Mr. Olympia took place in London. Many big names were absent or fading from the competitive scene. Arnold had returned to Hollywood permanently. Zane was aging out of his prime years. Menser had retired in frustration. The sport felt fractured, still recovering from the controversies and protests of the previous 2 years. The fans were confused. The judges were inconsistent. The magazines didn't know which story to tell anymore. And the industry was about to shift hard toward a new era, a new look, a new set of priorities that would make everything before it feel outdated. Into that chaos stepped Chris Dickerson at 43 years old. He walked out under the stage lights carrying 30 years of training, discipline, and patience. He delivered one of the most polished, refined, ever seen at an Olympia. Sharp lines running through every muscle group. Full muscle bellies with no flat areas. Conditioning that showed striations in places most competitors couldn't even achieve definition. Those legendary calves that made photographers scramble to get the perfect angle. And posing that flowed like choreography. Each transition executed with the precision of a dancer who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. He moved across the stage with grace and confidence, hitting every mandatory pose with absolute control, then flowing into his free posing routine with musicality that made it look effortless. The judges couldn't deny him. Not this time. Not with that physique standing in front of them. Chris Dickerson became Mr. Olympia on that night in London. He finally held the Sando Trophy he'd been chasing for 3 years. He'd earned it 10 times over. But the cultural moment didn't match the achievement. The audience was respectful, but the reaction wasn't explosive. There were no huge magazine features proclaiming a new era in bodybuilding. No supplement companies rushing to sign him as the face of their brand. No talk of Chris Dickerson as the future of the sport. He won his title, gave his speech, took his photos, and went home. And within a year, everything changed. Lee Haney won his first Mr. Olympia in 1984 and began an 8-year reign that completely redefined what an Olympia champion looked like. Bigger, thicker, more mass, wider shoulders, thicker backs, tree trunk legs. The aesthetic ideals shifted toward size, and the sport never looked back. By the time Dorian Yates arrived in the early 1990s, and then Ronnie Coleman in the late 1990s, bodybuilding had become about pushing the limits of human muscle mass. Chris Dickerson's refined, classical, perfectly proportioned look suddenly felt like it belonged to a different era entirely. By the time bodybuilding fans looked back at the timeline of champions, 1982 felt like a bridge year between the Arnold era and the mass monster era, a placeholder, a single year that didn't represent a movement or a change in direction. And Chris Dickerson slipped through the crack between those two mountains of history. What happened after his victory explains everything. Chris didn't defend his title in 1983. He dealt with injuries. His priorities shifted. Life pulled him in other directions, and the sport moved on fast without him. Samir Banout won in 1983. Haney took over in 1984. The Olympia stage kept turning, and Chris's moment passed into memory faster than anyone expected. History is written by the loud, the dramatic, and the long-reigning champions. The men who win once and leave don't get remembered the same way. Chris Dickerson was none of those things. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't reign for 8 years like Haney or win 15 pro shows in a single year like some of the later champions. He won once at 43 during a fractured year and then stepped back from the spotlight. That's not how legends are built in the public imagination. But let's be clear about what else was working against him, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Chris Dickerson was the first openly gay Mr. Olympia in the early 1980s. That wasn't something the bodybuilding industry knew how to market. The sport had always projected a hyper-masculine, almost aggressively heterosexual image. Anything that complicated that narrative was quietly pushed to the side. Chris faced prejudice and bias that were never officially acknowledged but were absolutely real. Doors closed that should have stayed open. Opportunities disappeared that should have been offered. Magazine covers went to other athletes. Sponsorship deals went elsewhere. Not because Chris wasn't qualified, because the industry wasn't ready to put an openly gay man at the center of its promotional machine. Add to that the fact that Chris was black in a sport that had extremely limited representation at the highest levels. Yes, he broke through and became the first African-American Mr. America in 1970. Yes, he won the Olympia in 1982. But breaking through on the contest stage, where judges have to score what's standing in front of them, is different from breaking through in the broader culture, where promoters and magazine editors and sponsors decide who gets to be the face of the sport. Chris succeeded despite barriers that most fans never saw and the industry never wanted to discuss. He proved himself over and over on every stage he stepped on. But once the trophy was handed out, the machinery of promotion and memory didn't know what to do with him, so they moved on to someone easier to market. Chris continued competing long past the point when most champions retire. In 1994, at 55 years old, he won the Masters Olympia in the 50-plus division and placed fourth overall in the Masters competition against men 10 and 15 years younger. That made him one of only two bodybuilders in history to win both the Mr. Olympia and the Masters Olympia. The other is Dexter Jackson. That's elite company. That's a career achievement that should be celebrated and remembered. But even that accomplishment is barely discussed in bodybuilding circles today. Most fans don't even know it happened. After retiring from competition, Chris lived in Florida and stayed involved in the sport as a guest poser, seminar speaker, and mentor to younger athletes. People who trained with him during those years remember his discipline, his patience, and his absolute refusal to cut corners or compromise his standards. He taught proper form. He taught the importance of posing practice. He taught younger bodybuilders that the sport was about more than just lifting heavy and eating big. It was about craft, about artistry, about respecting the process and honoring the history of what came before you. He donated materials and memorabilia to the Stark Center at the University of Texas to ensure his career would be preserved for researchers and historians who wanted to study the sport's real story, not just a version a magazine sold. Chris knew his story mattered, even if the broader culture wasn't listening. He also maintained his love for opera and classical music throughout his life. His singing voice remained elegant and trained even as he aged. He approached life the way he approached bodybuilding, with refinement, control, and deep respect for craft. He wasn't trying to be the loudest person in the room. He was trying to be the best version of himself. And in an industry that too often rewards spectacle over substance and noise over nuance, that approach left him undervalued and underappreciated. Chris Dickerson passed away on December 23, 2021, in Fort Lauderdale at the age of 82 after complications from a hip fracture and COVID-19. His death received some coverage in bodybuilding forums and websites, but it didn't make mainstream sports headlines the way other champions' deaths have. There were tributes from people who knew him and competed alongside him. Bill Pearl spoke about losing a friend and student. Other Golden Era competitors shared memories and photos, but the wider world barely noticed. Even in passing, Chris remained overlooked, and that's the tragedy of his legacy. So why is Chris Dickerson the most overlooked Mr. Olympia? Because he won with precision instead of spectacle. Because he was a transitional champion who held the title for 1 year between two dominant eras. Because his quiet, dignified personality didn't generate magazine drama or memorable feuds that fans could gossip about for decades. Because he was the first African-American Mr. America and one of the first black Mr. Olympias in a sport that gave limited promotional opportunities to athletes of color. Because he was openly gay in an era when the bodybuilding industry had no idea how to market that reality. Because his aesthetic, classical physique became unfashionable within 2 years of his victory as the sport shifted toward mass. Because he didn't defend his title and disappear from the Olympia stage just as quickly as he'd won it. Because all of these factors combined into a perfect storm of historical amnesia. Chris Dickerson is one of the most accomplished bodybuilders in history. 50 competitions, multiple universe titles, Mr. Olympia, Masters Olympia, first Ballot Hall of Fame inductee. But in conversation, in memory, in the stories told at gyms and on podcasts about bodybuilding's greats, his name barely comes up. That's not an accident. That's the result of a sport that chose other narratives, other faces, other champions to celebrate and immortalize. Chris Dickerson earned everything he achieved. He stood on stage and proved he was the best in the world. And history still managed to look past him. But here's what history can't erase. Those calves, that symmetry, that posing, that 43-year-old man standing under the bright lights in London, holding the Sando Trophy in his hands, and proving that true greatness doesn't need noise. It only needs truth. Chris Dickerson was a master of his craft. He was an artist in a sport that too often forgets to value art. He was a champion who won the right way, through discipline and patience and relentless dedication to perfection. And if you've never studied his physique, his career, or his quiet revolution, now you know. Now you've seen him. And maybe that's the beginning of his legacy finally getting the recognition it always deserved.